So good morning. My name is Chris Wright, one of your members here. I wanted to welcome everybody who's here we'll call it the 4th of July weekend, whether you're here in person or live streaming. Welcome, a hearty welcome from the church here. We've been studying in the book of Isaiah, and this morning we're looking at chapters 21 through hopefully 24. But if you want to look up chapter 21, we will start there. I can be assure you of that. I've entitled the lesson, Judgment Upon the Nations. At least that's what we're going with for the title of this section. Okay, let's open up with a map here. God has commanded that Babylon be taken. A harsh vision has been shown to me. The treacherous one still deals treacherously, and the destroyer still destroys. Go up, Elam, lay siege, Media. I have made an end of all the groanings she has caused. That's from Isaiah chapter 21, verse 2. Isaiah has previously announced the judgment against Assyria in chapter 14. And then he speaks in chapter 13, he has an oracle about Babylon coming to their demise too, which was approximately 65 years before Media, led by Cyrus, conquered Babylon. You see the red arrows coming down from the north. You see Babylon there. I'll show you another map here. There. How's that for a map? A whole page of a map. Okay. All right. This is the Medo-Persian expansion led by Cyrus. It begins in Persia. Let's see. We got a red dot right there. There's Persia right there. And the year is 559 BC. Then Media, directly north of that, is conquered by Cyrus in 550 BC. The expansion continues over to the west, to Lydia, the top left corner there, and Cyrus conquered that in 547 BC. And then back down to the center part there where you've got Neo-Babylon. Below that, you've got the city of Babylon itself. Let's see. You can see that maybe right about here. Babylon right there. Just to give you a macro view of some of the topics that Isaiah is discussing in the 8th century BC. That's the world he lives in. Incidentally, the Persian Empire will go on to conquer Egypt later on in the time sequence, about 525 BC. They're on the lower left in the pink. So they're definitely a force to be reckoned with. And from this verse, we see that actually God is calling up Elam, lay siege, Media. That's who he's talking about, to come in and overthrow Babylon. Okay. Okay, continuing in chapter 21, we have an oracle against two areas, Edom and Arabia. You can see them in red print on the map there. And there's a couple of key cities that are pointed out. Also at the top you see Assyria, and over to the right, about halfway down, is Elam. Just to give you a pictorial of where these places are. When I read in the scripture, I read about names I'm not really familiar with. It wasn't in Texas history, etc. So I had to do a little looking up and just familiarize myself with it, as I'm sure maybe you did too. Okay. There's another name for Edom. It's called Dunham, D-U-M-A-H. It's understood to be another name for Edom due to the mention of Seir, which is the capital city of Edom. You can see it there just to the left of the red print, Edom. You see Seir. That's the capital. Both Duna and Kedar, collectively, a term to describe desert dwellers, Bedouins. That's where 2 of the 12 sons of Ishmael, that's actually a couple of their names, was Dunham and Kedar, 2 of Ishmael's 12 sons. They settled in Arabia, but later moved to Edom. In Genesis 25, chapter 25, it talks about that. Isaiah's response to Edom is, if Seir really have relief, let them turn to the Lord, repent and return to the God of their fathers. Arabia, in this prophecy, it's a prophecy of distress to come to the neighboring peoples of Judah when the long-expected assault from Assyria would finally occur in 707 BC. So these events that are unfolding, they're not necessarily, as I mentioned in several other classes, in chronological order. Here we have an event that's really about 702. The previous map with the Medo-Persian Empire is after that, but it occurs first in the text. Anyways, so it's a little hard to understand it in a story flow like we're used to understanding things. Let's see. Okay, continuing in chapter 22, we got another nice map here for you. There's a burden of Jerusalem and the replacement of Shebna, which we'll discuss. These are the 2, basically the chapter is split into 2 sections, the first 14 verses and then the following 11. Okay, the burden of Jerusalem is in the first section. It's significant in that this is the principle, for the principal part, 4 nations were the enemies of God's people and repeatedly denounced in the earlier chapters by Isaiah. It's the nations around him he's pointing out they're the enemies. But in this particular instance, there's a sudden shift, and there appears a strong, almost hopeless denunciation of Jerusalem itself. At this point, alas, Jerusalem is actually counted as an enemy of truth and righteousness. Now think about that for a minute. You've got all the nations around, the heathen nations that are doing their wicked thing, and they've all been denounced in previous chapters. Now we get to chapter 22, and Jehovah actually turns his attention to Jerusalem, the capital of Judah. Who are these people? God's chosen people, right? Well, he says they've actually become an enemy of truth and righteousness. If you were in the Revelation class, we talked about enemies of the Lamb, enemies of Christ. And we named several of them, the devil or Satan, those opposing the saints, those opposing righteousness. One of the ones we talked about was Christians in their former state that have backslidden. There's probably no greater harm done than someone who's a Christian who's acting in hypocrisy. That's a real turnoff, and the world is real quick to point that out to you. If you're trying to persuade them to be a Christian, and they'll say, yeah, but what about, you Christians, you're the worst hypocrites. And unfortunately, that's not without some evidence that somebody would mount that charge. Same thing here. The people in Jerusalem were not acting like God's chosen people. They were acting just like the people around them. Therefore, God was going to deal with them in the same manner that he dealt with others, with one exception, a remnant. Okay. Oh, bad. Just a minute. There it is. Slight technical glitch. I have to get on the same page as you. Okay. This is a cross-sectional view of the Promised Land, Judah particularly. You see the little red circle, center of the map, about a third of the way down. You probably can't read it, but in that circle it says it's pointing to Jerusalem. Just to give you a graphic on that. To its right, you have this deep pit where the Jordan River comes through and forms the Dead Sea. To the left side of Jerusalem is the Judean hill country. Let me give you some stats, some statistics about this. Picking up in verse 1 of chapter 22. Jerusalem's elevation is about 2,500 feet above sea level. But it's nearly 4,000 feet above the Dead Sea just to the right. You see the little pool of water down there, the Dead Sea. It's about a 4,000 foot elevation change. I was just speaking with someone who said one of their family members had recently been over to Israel. Well, I've been to Israel several years ago in that area, and I came up by vehicle from the Dead Sea to Jerusalem, and it's like this. You're going 4,000 feet up and not very far, so it's really steep. It's a dry, arid mountain. It's not like the Colorado mountains where you've got water and pine trees, anything like that. This is just basically, it's desert. There's no water, but it's a tremendous gain in elevation. Okay, so when Jesus says to his disciples in the New Testament, "Let's go up to Jerusalem," he didn't necessarily mean they were in the south and they're going to go up north. He meant they were going to go uphill. Okay, so this just gives you a graphic of that. But what I want to point out to you is the Judean hill country, which is to the south of Jerusalem and just to its left on the map there, is 2,000 to 3,000 foot in elevation. What's our elevation here? Couldn't hear. 150 feet. Yeah, about 150 feet. 150 feet. Okay. So if you were at a range of 2,000 to 3,000 feet, would you think that you were in a valley? It's not a valley. Now, there's low spots within, relatively speaking, but you're not in a valley. And this is what's interesting about this term in chapter 22, valley of vision. He calls it a valley. Well, here's why. It turns out it's a valley of shame and immorality in which the chosen people of God had fallen. The chosen people had fallen. So he calls it a valley of vision. A little alliteration there, but the vaulted Mount Zion there's nothing high at all in the sense revealed here. In other words, it was a lowly place of shame, not high and exalted and lifted up like God's people should be, but it was the polar opposite. A wretched valley symbolically representing Judah, which at the very moment when God's merciful grace was no longer able to contain and overlook their wretched sins. So God has Isaiah speak this oracle against Jerusalem itself. They had become an enemy of truth and righteousness. Shocking. Okay, let's try this one more time here. There. Continuing in chapter 22, verse 5. It is a day of discomfiture and treading down of perplexity from the Lord, Jehovah of hosts, in the valley of vision, a breaking down of walls and a crying to the mountains. It was a time of crisis in Judah, and the people had looked everywhere except to the Lord. They're thinking about making an alliance with Egypt. Isaiah tells them, don't do it. Bad idea. Don't do it, which they didn't, but they were considering making an alliance with Syria and Israel to the north. And they did it first in earlier chapters, and then they recanted. But then, they're busy making preparations for the invading army, the Assyrians coming from the north. They tore down the houses outside the wall and used the materials to bolster up the walls around Jerusalem. They hewn out a big cistern so they have water supply. They're doing all these things. And they're looking everywhere except up to God. So by this suffering that's going on, because what's happening here in the picture, Jerusalem is laid siege a couple different times around 710 to 700 BC by the Assyrians. What they would do is surround the city with their army, their infantry, their chariots out in the valley. The men, their soldiers, covered the valley. And they would build these siege works. And they have these big catapults that would be like artillery, except they're slinging big stones. They didn't have modern munitions yet, but it would hit the wall and break a piece off, and it was a long process. And they'd build siege works. They wanted to break the wall down. They had a lot of soldiers, a lot of cavalry, which the people in the Jerusalem didn't have that. They didn't have much. They just had this big wall they were depending on. So this was really a call for penitent mourning, where they would shave their heads and walk around in sackcloth. But were they listening? No. In fact, the folks of Jerusalem celebrated riotously with joy during the invasions. This could be also referring to the Babylonian invasion, which came later in 586 BC, which was successful. But either way, the proper response was not to have revelry, orgies, drunkenness, which is what was going on at the time when they were surrounded by their enemies. Even when they were delivered, when the angel visited the Assyrian army one night, killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one night, they should have repented and offered thanks to God in humility. Instead, they were joyously reveling. So these rebels would end up dying unpardoned. Okay, the second part of chapter 22, I want to share with you the replacement of Shebna with Eliakim. I put this up here in different colors, two different columns. It's like a compare and contrast. Shebna, okay, you have to understand, I've got some characteristics listed up there, but he was basically the treasurer of the king's house. That would be like a comptroller in charge of the government's finances. So it was an important position. But Isaiah, his attitude toward Shebna is one of depreciation and scorn, because in this important position over the king's house, Isaiah went to visit him, and Shebna was at a site of a rock sepulcher that he was having carved out for himself high on a cliff. He wanted to leave a big name for himself. He was an important person, very important. Going to have a big, nice sepulcher everyone would see and know and remember. This is pretty selfish. This is pretty vain. It's pretty carnal. It's pretty rebellious. He represents the majority of old Israel, old secular Israel. In contrast, Eliakim was singled out as a representative of a different kind of individual. His characteristics were that he was truly a devoted follower of God, wholeheartedly committed to the Lord. He trusted God. He was part of what the scripture calls a righteous remnant. Few, but important. There's always the remnant. And he represents that in this. This contrast reminds me of Jesus' story in the New Testament about the prayers of the publican and then the tax collector. The first one was so proud and stood up and pounded his chest and boasted. And the second one said, he fell on his face and said, "Forgive me, Father, I am a sinner." Different attitude. Different attitude. So how pitiful it is when you have people and nations represented by Shebna, old Israel, that they're concerned about building themselves an impressive legacy, a tomb, a name, a title. Little did he know that he would be taken into slavery of captivity under the siege, be carted off by a foreign invader, die a shameful death, and have no impressive tomb, if any at all. Something to think about. What are we spending our time and our effort and our focus on while we have time in this life? It matters. God's watching. God's looking. He's looking for the Eliakims. He's looking for the remnant. Okay. Chapter 23. Flip page. This one's entitled Tyre and Sidon. Is this your city of revelry, the old, old city whose feet have taken her to settle in far-off lands? From verse 7. I've got a map here, and you see Phoenicia, it's the red color, and to the lower part of it, I've circled in red Tyre. Can you see it? Let me see if I can find it here. Right about there. There it is. Tyre, see it? There's Sidon above it, but there's Tyre. You got Israel down here, Jerusalem down here, just to see where it is. Now, it's something you'll see on the next map, but there's Tyre. The Bible talks a lot in Isaiah about this place. It's a pretty old city. Actually, there were two communities of Tyre. One was on the mainland, and the other was off the coast in a harbor on an island. Okay? And it was a very important commercial center because the harbor, they had deep water, they had a lot of sailing ships, and they had a fortified city there. I'll show you that in a minute. More about that. But Tyre had long been known as a trafficker. What does that conjure up there? Trafficker. Is that good or bad? Pretty bad, isn't it, Joe? Pretty bad. Okay, we can think of what that might mean in today's world, but that's actually used in the King James Version in verse 8 of chapter 23, that Tyre had long been a trafficker. Okay, a trafficker. What were they trafficking? Well, not only were they transporting all kind of goods from locations from Egypt to Spain to the Middle East, all over, which they became wealthy from, but that's not all. That's not all. They were also trafficking in human suffering. They were always found on the world's battlefields, stripping the dead and bargaining for the captives for slavery. That's traffickers. Verse 7 above is a prophetic reference to the selling of 30,000 citizens of Tyre into captivity of Alexander the Great in the 4th century. Their seemingly impossible destruction is used as an example to other haughty nations. You see that verse up there? It says, whose feet have taken her to settle in far-off lands. That's a reference to what's coming in about 350 years. They're actually going to be subjugated by Alexander the Great. I'm going to show you how. I thought this was a great find right here. What we have here is a map. On the right, we have the mainland. On the left, we have the island of Tyre. There was 2 cities, remember? That red thing in between is a causeway that was constructed by Alexander the Great, the causeway is 200 feet wide. So it's pretty long to get out to that island if it's 200 feet wide, okay, drawn to scale. And it was built from the ruins of Tyre that was on the mainland. He came, he conquered it, he tore it down, he used their rubble to build a causeway. See, it was difficult to get out to this island because it was offshore, number one. But number two, they had a 170-foot high rampart built around it. So if you're going to try and take a city or anything, what you don't want to have to do is you don't want to have to cross the water. It puts you at a big disadvantage when you have to come on shore. Okay, think of D-Day, Normandy. And number two, a big high wall they had that at Normandy also. A little machine gun nest at the top. So that makes a place like that really easy to defend relative to the attackers. So Alexander chartered 250 ships to form a blockade of the harbors that created the siege in 322 BC. So this is years later, but it's prophesied here. Who planned all this? Well, it tells us in verse 8. He who hath taken his counsel against Tyre, the crowning city, whose merchants are princes, whose traffickers are the honorable of the earth. Okay, this is God's talking about them. The honorable. That's who the earth honors, in other words. It's not honorable in his sight, but. Okay, he has made the kingdoms tremble. This is Isaiah in verse 11 speaking of Jehovah. Tyre is destroyed like a forgotten harlot, which that's what the text says in chapter 23. Can you think of another two-city biblical example that was destroyed by God? Sure you can. Sodom and Gomorrah. Very good. Very good. I found it interesting that this one had a similar, Sidon and Tyre, twin city names here. There was actually two cities at one time, and God takes them all out. Just a second here. Those who mock his second coming and therefore his judgment willfully, deliberately forget that the heavens and the earth were reserved for fire and kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. 2 Peter 2:9. I think it's a little earlier. It's right in that range. Is there anything else here about this? The 250 ships, the whole island was surrounded by a 170-foot rampart. Okay. Okay. Turn the page. Chapter 24. Okay, the next several chapters, chapter 24 to 27. The term "in that day" are used 7 times. History tells us of cities that have stood in opposition to the Almighty that were turned into ruin, perpetual trash heaps. The city of Nineveh, was founded by the mighty man in Assyria. There's an example. The Creator's great power is displayed in his dealings with the nations. As we go through Isaiah, that's what we really see. We've got these great and powerful nations that nobody's able to stop. No earthly power. But God puts an end to them. He says enough is enough, and he has them removed from their position for their wickedness. At the same time, God's benevolent character is demonstrated. He always leaves room for a remnant, for the righteous who are willing to obey the word of truth, his word. God has always been a stronghold to the poor and needy. When it says poor and needy, it's talking about the righteous. The righteous. In these chapters, 24 to 27, they're really prophecy of eschatological, means end times, conclusion. It's about the end times of the Christian dispensation, the final judgment. It's a little section in here. We've been talking about the nations back in the 8th century around Israel and Judah, what's happening. But now we're going to look forward. We're turning the other direction. We're going to look forward in time to the final judgment. And this little section of Isaiah is, I'm convinced, is really about the end times. It's tucked right in here. It fits for what's about to happen in those countries that he's writing to, but it has a double meaning. It also has a meaning for final judgment, the second advent of Christ, when time itself shall cease to exist as we know it. There's excellent reasons for this view. In these chapters, it mentions the earth, not Palestine or Jerusalem, but the earth 16 times. It refers to the earth in chapter 24 alone. Undeniable references to conditions that elsewhere in the Bible are definitely associated with the final day. A number of the passages in this section, particularly chapter 24, have a direct corollary in the book of Revelation. Same type of wording describing same type of event. To me, they're linked. They're talking about the same thing. That's why I think this section is really about eschatology, end time, final judgment. Okay. One of the things I mentioned as we went through the earlier chapters of Isaiah, and God pronounces an oracle or a judgment against this nation, that nation, the other nation. Now he's even talking about the chosen people. I said, I like it when it explains why. Why is God doing that? That way the reader doesn't have to walk away and say, well, God's just capricious and does things without reason, without rhyme, But this is not the case. Judgment is the consequence of sin. Listen to the first selected verses from beginning of chapter 24. Behold, the Lord lays the earth waste, devastates it, destroys its surface, and scatters its inhabitants. He takes the earth and shakes it like we would a little can with some marbles in it. Just shakes it out and dumps it out. The earth will be completely laid waste and completely despoiled, for the Lord has spoken this word. Chapter 24 really assures that all nations are going to face judgment, including Israel, Judah, God's chosen people. Jehovah's ability his ability is described in catastrophic terms in these chapters, particularly 24. Desolation of the planet is mentioned 16 times in just chapter 24. Judgment before the Creator is without respect of persons. It doesn't matter what your position is, what your color is, etc., etc. Rather, each will be judged on the basis of their character, not external traits. That's in verse 2. The globe has been polluted by the violation of all of God's commandments. Just as an observation, the current political push toward green environmentalism would do well to consider this. They're correct that we're reaching the danger point in the earth. It's destruction. But it is a result of man's activity, as they purport. But carbon is not the culprit, but rather sin. So they've missed the whole point. They search and strain in vain futility because they failed to consider a correct root cause analysis. And even they think they can solve the carbon problem, everything will be just peachy. They missed the whole point. The problem is the pollution of sin. It's contaminating, it's polluting, it's destroying both individual societies as well as the physical earth. Okay, judgment on the earth. The earth is polluted by its inhabitants, for they transgressed the laws, violated the statutes, and broke the everlasting covenant. What is this everlasting covenant? This actually comes from Genesis chapter 6, starting in verse 6, where it says, "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man, society, his blood shall be shed." That's an everlasting commandment. When this is ignored and broken, society degenerates into total chaos and anarchy. The result is professional murders, mercenaries, wholesale refining of right and wrong, the arrogant hypocrisy of those demanding the killing of our most vulnerable, the unborn, and dare to lecture the rest of us on justice. Once human life has been devalued to convenience, a matter of convenience, all that the carnal, depraved mind can imagine is involved in their full rebellion. Romans chapter 3 mirrors this same fact of breaking the everlasting covenant. And yes, it does pollute the earth, but carbon's not the problem. I'm not saying, just to clarify, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be good stewards and do what we reasonably can to take care of things. I was always taught to leave a room or a place better than I found it when I came. And that's a worthy goal, okay? But if we take it to the extreme that becomes something we're worshiping nature rather than God, that's a cardinal mistake. Fatal cardinal mistake. Okay. Consequence of sin. Therefore, a curse devours the earth, and those who live in it are held guilty. Therefore, the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few men are left. John.
You know, God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah and all those other cities in that valley. And we have all sorts of different examples all through the Old Testament when Israelites camped near the godless people and ended up worshiping their God. And it's funny that we can't seem to make that connection.
Okay. The point is that somehow we're unable to make the connection that just as people in the Old Testament were worshiping false gods, okay, and coming up with a really bad result, I'll add, I guess we can't make the connection because as a society we're doing the same thing.
And will offend people that are lost and don't care.
Okay, and that comment was, and we in so believing this will and acting in righteousness will offend those who are lost. Is that the fair assessment of what you said? Okay, that's mirrored in Romans chapter 1 at the end of it where it goes on to say, hey, the debased mind, the depraved mind will end up doing all these terrible things, and they'll think it's strange that you don't join in. Okay, about verse 32. But also in Isaiah, the good book of Isaiah, chapter 59 and verse 15, it says, if you are righteous and won't go along with the wicked, you become a target, specifically to your point. Not just do they think it's strange, they will actually make you the subject of their attack. Because light makes those in the dark uncomfortable. Okay, let's see. A surface confession cannot bring escape from just punishment. For no matter where the ungodly run or hide, the justice of God will reach them. The heavenly order to execute murderers is not an option given to human societies, but an order. Any human society stupid enough to ignore that heavenly command will soon find itself devastated by all kinds of violence, murder, and crime. Is that what we see going around the world? Around our country right now? There's something else I want to mention. 2 Peter chapter 3, he speaks of a consuming fire for the world's ungodly. But few men are left, and therein is our hope. But few men are left. Well, who's left? Zion, the redeemed, the church, all the same, all different names for the same, the true spiritual Israel, the church. Those not under condemnation. Isaiah 3, verse 10 talks about that. He talks about what will happen with the wicked. He says, but it is not so for the righteous. It will go well with them. It will go well with them. Romans 8:1 also reassures us that there is now therefore no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So God always protects his remnant. Okay. Now, come back. Wow. We'll just introduce this. We're going to run out of time here. This was the last verse for today. This is chapter 24 now. This is really where this is the last part of it. They raise their voices. They shout for joy. They cry out from the west concerning the majesty of the Lord. Therefore, glory in the Lord in the east. The name of the Lord, the name that the God of Israel in the coastlands of the sea. From the ends of the earth, we hear songs, glory to the righteous one. Even in the midst of this description of the terrible things that are going to befall the wicked, we have this little looking away, this proleptic, and we get a glimpse into heaven for what's in store for the righteous, the redeemed. That's really reassuring. This really is looking way into the future, but it's nonetheless true, and it should be a reassurance to us that following the righteous path always pays the best dividends. Okay. There it is. Okay, last slide. Go back. Okay, judgment. We've talked about judgment. Men everywhere have broken the everlasting covenant and will be held accountable. There's no secrets in eternity. You might have a secret here, but eternity, there aren't any. This world is headed somewhere. It's headed for judgment. Second point, Jehovah is still on his throne, even though Adam's sinful race has rebelled against the Creator, Jehovah, and is on a collision course with disaster that culminates in the destruction of the whole sinful race, just as Isaiah promised. However, the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptation. There's this righteous remnant. We want to be part of the righteous remnant. And a half-hearted, from the lips out